Welcome everybody to the Surplus Trust Policy Dialogue. Today, we are looking at the growing economic and financial crisis in Zimbabwe. What will be the effects on the elections in 2023? And we are honored and privileged to have among the best commentators on the Zimbabwe situation, in particular, Stephen Hanke, Professor of Applied Economics at Johns Hopkins University, and Senior Fellow and Director of the Troubled Currencies Project at the Libertarian Cato Institute in GC. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you.
Then we have a regular on our program, Tinashe Marapata, CEO and founder of Leon Africa. He has been here before, an economist, familiar with the figures and familiar with the terrain that we're discussing this evening. And he runs, he's a regular on Twitter. You can see him, Anyenyedzi, that's his Twitter handle name. And we rely so much on him in terms of seeking to explain some of these things for us. And last but not least, Chennai Mtambasere, a development economist, also not a newcomer here. As I said earlier on, we're going to have Stephen looking at the extent of the economic and financial crisis and illustrating that in figures and statistics. And as I said earlier on the causes, in particular, why history is repeating itself. We have been through this before, 2006, 2008. Tinashe on the economic implications, and Chennai on the political ramifications. So without much ado, I'll ask Stephen to come in and make his presentation. Stephen.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me first begin by indicating that the state of the world in Zimbabwe is pretty dire, actually. They now have the highest inflation rate in the world. I measured every day. It's 624% per year right now. That's the highest inflation rate in the world. The currency, the Zim dollar, has depreciated by about 79% since the first of the year. So it's one of the truly junk currencies. It's essentially worthless. So that is the state of play in Zimbabwe as I speak. Now, the question is, actually, how do you get a high inflation rate? What causes that? And the cause is always the same thing: too much money being printed. The printing presses are going too fast. And in Zimbabwe, of course, we've had experiences with hyperinflation. You mentioned the 2007-2008 episode. There was a second episode of hyperinflation in Zimbabwe in 2012. And those episodes are marked by an inflation rate that has to exceed 50% per month. So we're not nearly up there yet in Zimbabwe, but if this keeps up, we could have a third hyperinflation in really a rather short period of time. There have only been 64 episodes of hyperinflation in world history, and 2 of those episodes have taken place in Zimbabwe. So what happens is that the government spends money and they don't have a means to finance that. No tax revenue, that's deficient, or they can't access international bond markets or local bond markets to raise enough money to finance the government expenditures. So what do? The finance minister runs over to the governor of the central bank and says, I've got some great bonds I want to sell you. And the government is credited, the printing press spins around, and money is created. And that is really the nub of the problem. how do you put a hard budget constraint in that prohibits the monetary authority from financing the government or monetizing the deficit being produced by the government? And there are two ways to do that. One way is with what they call a currency board system. Now, in Rhodesia, in both North Rhodesia and South Rhodesia, you had a currency board from 1940 to 1956, and that worked very well. Most of Africa, I might add, did have currency boards in the colonial period. In the colonial period, most of Africa actually had currency boards. There have been over 70 currency boards that have existed. None have ever failed. Now we have 14. The most notable one was designed and put in place by John Greenwood, a colleague of mine, collaborator of mine in Hong Kong in 1983. They had a huge currency crisis in Hong Kong at the time. The currency board was put in, and it's worked like a charm ever since. There are other currency boards. 4 of the new ones that have been put in, I had a hand in. The one in Estonia in 1992, the one in Lithuania in 1994, Bulgaria 1997, and Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1997. So those are a way to put a hard budget constraint in the system. And that is the key to the whole thing, a hard budget constraint. Now, what does that mean? How does a currency board work? Well, it does issue a local currency, but that local currency is backed 100% with anchor currency reserves, and the local currency trades at an absolutely fixed exchange rate with the anchor and is fully and freely convertible. So the local currency really becomes a clone of whatever the anchor happens to be. In Hong Kong, for example, the anchor is the US dollar, so the Hong Kong dollar is essentially a clone of the US dollar. The hard budget constraint comes into the picture with these currency boards because the only way they have no discretionary monetary policy, and they can't issue credit. Currency boards have no discretionary monetary policy, and they cannot issue credit. So the only way the fiscal authorities could actually obtain local currency in a currency board country is if they took the anchor currency, foreign exchange, into the currency board and exchanged it for the local money. But they couldn't go in and get credit. So how about this solution for Zimbabwe? I personally think it would work only under one set of conditions, and that is if the currency board was located outside of Zimbabwe. Kurt Schuler and I have designed let's say a draft currency board law in which the currency board would be located in Switzerland. The reserves would be kept in Switzerland. There'd be 5 board members, and only 2 of them could be residents of the local country, in this case Zimbabwe, and 3 would have to be external, and they couldn't be from representatives from any neighboring country. So it would be pretty secure. I think if a currency board was put in place in Harare, for example, I really wouldn't trust it. And so therefore, what would I trust? Full dollarization. Full dollarization is exactly the same thing as a currency board without the local money. You just use the anchor, whatever the anchor is. If it's a US dollar, remember in the unity government period in 2009 until July 2013, you did have full dollarization in Zimbabwe. And what happened? The Minister of Finance was Beatty, and he was balancing the budget. Why? Because he couldn't take any, he couldn't receive credit from any monetary authority because the country was fully dollarized. So the budget was more or less balanced. The economy boomed, and inflation was crushed, by the way. The hyperinflation, of course, went completely away, and it worked very well. Now, there are 33 countries or jurisdictions that are dollarized. One, I had a hand in doing two of them. One in Montenegro in 1999, the hyperinflating Yugoslav dinar was the currency for Montenegro. And what we did, we made the German mark a legal tender, and we, in short, dollarized Montenegro. The inflation went away, everything was stabilized, and has worked fine ever since. The other country that I had a hand in dollarizing is Ecuador, and we did that in 2000. Inflation has been controlled, the country has been stable, and that system is the longest living currency regime they've ever had in Ecuador. So it's had quite a long life in a very unstable environment, typically. So I think with that, that kind of summarizes what I think the problem is. The problem, we have a junk currency in Zimbabwe. We have the world's highest inflation in Zimbabwe. And we have a central bank that extends credit to the government, and we don't have a hard budget constraint. So how do you get the hard budget constraint? You either do it with a currency board. One located in Switzerland, as I outlined, would be fine, and it would work very well. The other alternative is to do exactly what they did in 2009, 2000 to 2013 under the unity government at the time, fully dollarized. Those are the only two options. Everything else you would be discussing is ridiculous. It won't work in Zimbabwe. They have very weak institutions, and of course that's one reason why you want a currency board or dollarization. There are no preconditions associated with making these two types of systems that impose hard budget constraints work. No preconditions. You install them right away. In Estonia, for example, I helped design and install a currency board we put in June of 1992. And what was the currency? The currency they were using was the Russian ruble. And they didn't even have a new post-Soviet constitution when we put the currency board in. And it took only about 30 days from the time I introduced the idea until the time we actually installed it. So you can do these things very fast, and there are no preconditions. They always work. So I think with that little introduction, I can stop. I have other reforms that I think would be wise to implement in Zimbabwe if and only if you had full dollarization or a currency board located in Switzerland. If you had those things, then you would have stability. And while stability might not be everything, everything's nothing without stability. You can't do any reforms. So whatever they're doing, as long as they have the central bank in Zimbabwe, it won't work.
What went wrong, Stephen, in the outset? You tell our viewers, our participants, what in your view went wrong, even in the previous?
Well, what went wrong is there's several factors. One is the political culture of the place. You essentially have ZANU-PF as a one-party system. It is a one-party system with ZANU-PF running the show. But ZANU-PF, from my point of view, it really operates more like a criminal organization than a political organization. So that is one problem. And what allows ZANU-PF to operate that way is the fact that you have a central bank, and the central bank is printing money. It's all revolves around the central bank. If you got rid of the central bank and replaced it with a currency board located in Switzerland, or you fully dollarized, everything would be stable, and you would be on the road to repair. You would be on the road to repair.
But then, why, in your view, when the solution appears as obvious as that, mainly a currency board, why haven't the people in Harare resorted to it? Is it by design? Is it because of some ulterior motives to do with what others acknowledge is a level of looting that has been done through such
Ibo, it's very simple. The elites in Zimbabwe don't want to be put in a straitjacket. If you had a currency board based in Switzerland, or you fully dollarized, you put all these politicians and bureaucrats in straitjackets. They don't want that. They don't want a hard budget constraint. They want to keep robbing the country. That's why I say the criminal aspect is definitely in there. It's definitely in the game. And if you took the basic nutrient in the system, the ecosystem, out, that means that the money being produced by the central bank, you would find all of these politicians would be very unhappy. It would change the whole.
Yes, I was speaking to a former minister, I won't name here, a former minister of finance in Zimbabwe, and he attested to the view that the ministry is well staffed, Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning. There's some of the best Zimbabwean experts in that ministry, but that there has been always a legacy of political interference, such as that you have referred to. And I think the biggest undertaking would be to find out precisely the level of that interference, and by whom, and for what purpose. I think
I think it obviously starts with the head. You have to, you know, where does a fish start rotting first? At the head.
Yes. I think I will leave Stephen for a while. I'm sure people will be coming. There's a lot of interest in what you have to say. I can see the turnout is very good because obviously Stephen Hanke is a draw card. So I'll come back to you, Stephen. And let me turn to Tinashe. Tinashe, if you can take over from where Stephen left off, and if you need be, also draw some issues or extrapolations from the extent of the economic and financial crisis and the economic implications thereof. Tinashe.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ivo. And thank you very much, Steve, for that. I think it's very interesting. I've got two questions, perhaps, that I would like to perhaps just talk about based on what Steve has provided us as the alternatives, which is a currency board based in Switzerland or full dollarization. I agree with him. I'm more of a proponent of a currency board, but we'll get back to the currency board later. But I wish to point out that dollarization cannot happen again in Zimbabwe for precisely the same reason that Steve highlights, which is the central bank. So local clearing the reason why dollarization eventually moved out or failed post the GNU government, post 2012, was that the central bank became a conduit for the local clearing. So when we say local clearing, what we mean is the financial institutions had to lodge real US dollars with the central bank. And suddenly the central bank started creating these phantom dollars in the system to such an extent that eventually the system was without dollars. So it was not a full dollarization. So as long as the RBZ, the central bank, is still constituted the way it is and is still in charge of the clearing, we're already seeing it now that the Nostro accounts, which are supposed to have full US dollars, close to 800, 900 million are credit deposits. They are not backed by real dollars in the system at the present moment. And this problem, if we were to dollarize, would be bigger. But Zimbabweans are smarter in the sense that they've taken out their dollars, they keep their dollars under the mattresses. So the cash, the dollarization that we'll have is not an Ecuador dollarization. We're already starting to see it. It's a cash dollarization. The whole system is informal. It's more like Somalia, where everybody keeps hard cash. They don't trust the banks with their US dollars, because if you put US dollars in the banking system, you're unable to withdraw those US dollars. And this is the same risk we face if we were to fully dollarize, that the dollars within the system will eventually disappear, and what we will be left with are phantom dollars or surrogates of dollars and not real dollars. So I tend to agree that what we need is a currency board to solve the issue. And I may articulate maybe, first of all, the points of departure, where I think that I agree with him that the currency board main account must not be in Zimbabwe. We must piggyback on real institutions. I disagree that it will be in Switzerland. I think that the nuances and Zimbabweans in Africa, I think that that would not play out well. But I think that there are stronger institutions within Africa that we can piggyback on. One of which is South Africa, the South African Reserve Bank. The other is the Africa Development Bank. These are institutions where we can hold our currency boards account, and they have the necessary institutional support and transparency that we will need. We can then have external auditors that will audit our reserves on a weekly basis and feedback into the market, using whatever platform, but for transparency and clarity sake. So it's just a slight point of departure on the currency board, but I do agree that it should be outside of Zimbabwe. I just disagree that it should be in Switzerland for a number of nuances within the political realm of Africa as well as Zimbabwe specifically. But there are certain countries that we can piggyback on, one of which is South Africa, which is our largest trading partner, by the way. Then certain areas of where we do converge is the biggest problem with Zimbabwe. And here I would like to differ slightly again with Ivo. The issue of corruption. I think that corruption is pervasive right across the world, more so in certain states. I don't think that Zimbabwe is any way unique or exaggerated more than any other country in terms of corruption. I think that we do punch above our weight, perhaps, but I think that corruption is a constant in most countries. Where we differ with most countries is that the way we manage our monetary affairs. And I think that even with a currency board with full dollarization, corruption will still be there. If people still remember between the GNU years where we had serious growth, economic growth, corruption was actually endemic, and there was more, if you remember, with regards to the diamonds and what was happening in the diamond sector. A lot of those revenues were not coming through the budget. But our monetary system was rules-based. There was less discretion in our monetary system. The central bank has made it easier for corruption to then affect and pollute our monetary system. So unfortunately, Zimbabwe has endemic problems. We can't solve all the problems all at once. But I think if I were to choose, the first thing I would want is to immunize ourselves from the corruption risk, from all the other risks, as far as the monetary policy, or as far as the monetary institutions are concerned. So a currency board just ensures that whatever corruption happens, it happens in the fiscus, but it does not pollute or change our monetary base. The biggest problem is we've done this now for over 30 years. It didn't start in 2000. It started in 1995, where we have been continuously debasing our currency. And now it's twice in a decade that this has happened to us. And I think that the first priority that we need to do is to reform the institution. Our monetary institutions are simply not strong enough. So whatever is happening in the fiscus, whatever corruption is happening, in Zimbabwe, it becomes 10 times more. It appears as if it's 10 times more, because the mechanism in which it happens is our monetary system. But if we immunize ourselves from the monetary system, corruption would happen, but not to the extent or would have the impact that it currently has. So those are just, I wanted to just give a bit of color to the presentations that we've already had. Going forward, what are we seeing in Zimbabwe? I think that the biggest problem that we've had is a case of Zimbabweans no longer trust the institution, the monetary institutions. So whatever the institution comes up with, Zimbabweans are scared and they run away from it. But what that does, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, in the sense that the more and more people are afraid of the Zimbabwean dollar, the more and more they're scurrying away and keeping US dollars. And they're not using the formal sector. They're keeping their US dollars under the pillow. This is dangerous for our economy. And it shows the lack of confidence that Zimbabweans have with their institutions. The biggest problem we have is right now we're building, there's a lot of construction that's happening, government construction that's happening, but they're using short-term money. So ordinarily in road constructions, you would take 15, 20-year money that you would use to build. But what is happening is they're borrowing short-term, they're using short-term money from the central bank to build these roads. That is why our inflation is the highest in the world. Now, you've got quite a quandary there, in the sense that they have made it an election pledge to build as many roads as possible. They're not going to stop, because this is a political agenda that they have, and they will find the money in as many ways as possible. So I don't think that there will be any correction up until after the election. So if we are scared and if we're worried that Steve Hanke has his inflation rate at 6.25, I think the worrying point is it's likely to get higher before the election. So I think that we'll probably get into a hyperinflation spiral very soon. and it can only be corrected after the election. I don't see how it can be corrected before an election. But anyway, I'm not a political analyst. So I suppose that the political analyst can speak into that. But if we look at what's happening at the present moment, this is, when you look at our seasons, this is not the worst time in Zimbabwe. The worst time happens around October, when our grain is at its lowest, when tobacco inflows have dried, and there is no currency at all, and we're preparing for the rainy season. This is the time when we demand more of the currency. So we expect that the depreciation of our currency would be worse. If the Zim dollar has already lost 70% of its value, you can sort of imagine what's going to happen in October, November. So with that, I think I will hand over to Ibo, and we'll speak later if there's any clarification that's required.
No, I'm coming back to you right away.
Okay.
It's this spiral in inflation, and you were saying that the October, and I agree with you, come October, we'll probably see a situation where things are so serious. What would be the status of the Zim dollar by October? That's the first. My second question is, what are the implications for the man or woman on the street in this situation? How will it affect people's lives? I know I'm talking from an economic point of view. I know you're staying away from the political, but really, what will the economy look like by October, 3 months hence? What are the implications for the future of the Zim dollar? You said dollarization is important, it won't happen. And we know, you and I know, that so far there is no one discussing the currency board. It's something we'll discuss at the end. If that is the solution, Steve has suggested that is the solution, currency board. We want to end maybe on note of how we can get the system to institute currency board. But in the meantime, the economic implications of the hyperinflation spiral, the implications of the decline in the value of the Zim dollar, all of this, what will this mean for the person on the street?
Okay, thanks, Ivo. So we started the year at, the exchange rate was 210 to the dollar. We are now at 900. It's close to 1,000 to a dollar, and this is 7 months in. So I think if you just extrapolate, we are probably, we'll probably hit 2,000 or 3,000 by the end of the year. But what has happened is people are also fast cash dollarizing. So I make the distinction between an Ecuador type of dollarization and a Somalia type of dollarization. We are under the Somalia dollarizing, which is we're using cash dollars more and more, which is we're snuffing cash out of the system and keeping it under our mattress. So I think that by the end of the year, they will probably not have a Zim dollar to speak of, or it will really be at the margins. That's very clear. In terms of the everyday person, unfortunately, they will be worse off because a lot of their salaries are still in Zimbabwean dollars. A lot of people were employed. It's woolly Zim dollars, or it's half Zim dollars, and the other is US dollars. But we're earning less and less. The economy is actually contracting, and poverty, extreme poverty, is 49%. You'd expect by the end of the year, it will be much more. Why? Because we've already started importing grain. So the grain that we produced last year was just simply not enough. So I think it's a dire situation when you think about it. And perhaps that, from a political perspective, when you're going towards an election, might help push the political actors to act, to find a solution. Now, you're right that not so many people are talking about the currency board, but there are a lot, even within the powers that be, within government, that are exploring it and want to know a lot more about it. Why? And it comes back to cash dollarizing, because the more and more the economy actually cash dollarizes, the more it contracts. So if you look at government revenues are better off using the financial system. So tax is only efficient when you use the financial services system. And if more and more people are using cash and are outside the financial system, it means that government revenues will sink even further. And I think that's a big worry to them. And that in itself will perhaps push them to finding some sort of solution. We saw Adesina, the Africa Development Bank president, coming to Zim. These are creditors who are seriously looking at Zim and are worried. So this is perhaps where the solution might come from, not necessarily from Zimbabweans, but from Zimbabweans' new creditors. The Chinese, for example, have sunk in $1.5 billion in Hanke Station 7 and 8. That's about 600 megawatts. Now, they don't want to be paid in Zim dollars. They've made it very clear that their loan should be paid in US dollars. And with that, we saw a presidential decree, SI 133, which mandated ZESA, which is the electrical company in Zimbabwe, to start charging in US dollars. And this is primarily to service these creditors. So you have a lot of creditors, a lot of pressure that's coming from the creditors. And these creditors will be extremely worried if the US dollar cash is not in the system, but is outside of the system. It just means that they will not get paid. And they're extremely worried. So you find a lot of pressure from the Chinese, who are very serious business people. They've seen what has happened in Sri Lanka, what has happened in Zambia, that they can lose their money. They've sunk in a lot of money, they can lose it. And I think that that's where, if we push where the interest in the currency board is also coming from, because these are institutions that are trying to find a solution. And right now we have two roads. We have one that's leading us to cash dollarizing, which is everybody's worse off, and the government is worse off. And then the other is a currency board that then stabilizes. You don't want to go into an election with hyperinflation. That's the worst thing you could ever do, with empty shells. So if I were the government of the day, what I would want is stable prices. And you can only get stable prices at this particular moment in time because people don't trust the central bank. It's only a currency board that can offer or proffer that solution of stable prices.
Okay, Tinashe, I just want to set of questions for you before I retire you for the time being. The first is that the initial dollarization. You saw a report of the meeting between the Reserve Bank and business people, CZI and ZNCC yesterday. And the major complaint was that they also want to use US dollars, just as the fuel companies are doing at the moment. That's one. What is the implication of that? The second one is that you made reference to the government embarking on the infrastructure development as part of the election campaign. But last week you had a circular from the Reserve Bank or wherever it was, criminalizing construction companies as being responsible for the exchange rate discrepancies. My question is, how will government be able to sustain the momentum for infrastructure development on the one hand, and at the same time contain the impact on inflation as they pay these people in Zim dollars? My last question, of course, is that you mentioned ADB, and Adesina is a good friend of mine. I used to, by the way, he worked at the Surplus Trust, Adesina, in the 90s. I was not able to see it, but what have you picked up as to the message that you implied? Are they impacting on the Zimbabwe policy framework, or do you expect them to do so, especially with respect to the to the currency board. You made reference to, and I'm picking up on that, that maybe it's better to have the ADB host the currency board rather than Switzerland. Is there anything you've heard in this regard? These are the 3 questions I have for you.
Okay, all right. I'll start with the last one. No, I have not heard anything. I'm purely speculating.
Okay.
I won't comment much on that. I'm purely speculating. And then I will come back to the other 2 questions on the fuel companies, that businesses want to be the fuel company, want to be like the fuel industry. The fuel companies, if you note, they ask for cash. Whenever we fill in at a filling station, they ask for US dollar cash. They do not even want a US dollar swipe, right? Because when you swipe, if it's US dollar swipe, the money goes into a clearing, right? It's now in the RTGS system, and those are not real dollars. So the fuel companies, why we still have fuel, is because they ask for real US dollar cash. And I sort of did a poll on why, these fuel companies want US dollar cash. Eventually, this US dollar cash finds its way to Zambia. And in Zambia, that's when the transfer is made for us to get fuel into Zimbabwe. Only US dollar cash is real US dollars in Zimbabwe. Just because if you swipe, it may not be real US dollars. And that's why a lot of companies are asking for that ability to charge in US dollars. But what they really want is US dollar cash. In Zimbabwe, yes, it's not real US dollars if it's in the system. It's just a credit. And that credit may not get to Switzerland or to China. The only thing that will get to Switzerland or China is real US dollar cash. So I think that's where businesses were coming from. We've seen our retailers declaring dividends in US dollars. The only reason why they're able to declare dividends in US dollar is because they're getting US dollar cash. Now, the big worry is that the economy of Zimbabwe is now purely reliant, well, not purely, that might be an exaggeration, but is heavily reliant on diaspora remittances as well as aid from the Western nations. This is what fuels this US dollar cash. Now, with what's happening globally, we don't expect the remittances to come in. So this is the big worry for Zimbabweans, for the general Zimbabwean, that if all these cash dries up, then we have a problem. I think I've answered 2 of your questions. There's a third one that you asked, Ibo. If you just don't mind, just remind me.
The construction, the infrastructure development, and,
yes,
and who have been criminalized now for contributing to the exchange rate fiasco. And yet you are saying in the same vein, they're going to continue doing infrastructure development. They have. We all know.
They have to do those roads, and we all know who's doing the construction, the road constructions. Nothing is going to happen to them, but I think that that was just a moral suasion by the minister trying to speak to the problem, because it's apparent, everybody knows that these construction companies, all they need to do is to just raise an invoice with Treasury and it will be paid. And they use implied rates that are now way above 1,000 because they won't get paid there and then, and it takes time for them to import raw materials. Remember, road construction, you need to import raw materials from abroad. What do you use to import raw materials? You do not use Zim dollars. You use hard currency. So is that going to stop? I don't think so, especially going towards an election. And the government of the day has made it very clear that infrastructure is their big issue.
Yes.
The problem is they're using short-term money to construct roads that typically require 15-year, 20-year money. You're not going to get a payback within a year. and they're using, 90-day money to build a road. So it's
that's why I was raising the question, because the resources are finite, and I just wonder how they're going to juggle around that. And therefore, let me move to Chennai to reflect on that. Chennai has given us very technically, as he always does, the bleak picture ahead. And I note the issue of the October thing, when grain has declined to bare minimum. The Zim dollar is about 2,000 to 1. The pressure on prices, soaring prices already. What do you think? What are the political implications? A difficult one, but let's go for it.
Yeah, so just before I go into literally how will this pan out just ahead of the elections, and even moving into October, like was said before by Tinashe, it's important, I think, to highlight why are we here? How have we got here? Because I think we need to demystify some of the things that have been said, that there's a willingness by government, by the ruling party, to do something different, to do something better. I think we can easily say that is not the case. So why are we here? We know that over the last, from about 2015, 2016, we've seen a lot of quasi-fiscal activities coming out of the central bank, the introduction of the bond. We saw as well, what was his name again, the previous Minister of Finance, Chinamasa. He was making payments sporadically to the IMF and the World Bank and increasing the bank reserve ratios. And that kind of brought our banking sector to its knees. And I think the trust factor really started to go down from that point. The country's risk profile started to worsen from that point as well. So this, I think, is what we would attribute. A lot of our issues really began with incorrect and unsound policies coming out from the central bank, wherein its role, we have seen, is it a central bank? Is it a Ministry of Finance? Are they doing fiscals? Are they doing monetary policy? It's all been a bit of a mishmash. And we have seen a lot of statutory instruments being announced even in this year. I mean, I have lost count of how many times they make a new announcement between the Ministry of Finance and the central bank. And so these types of sporadic quasi-fiscal activities really have undermined the Zimbabwean economy significantly. And here we are where we are now. We have seen, I think Tinashe was talking about construction contracts, etc. We need to align this as well to public debt. What is our debt structure looking like? Since 2009, we have seen, for example, China now owning more than 50% of our public debt statement. So, and that has further implications again, when you look at who is constructing these roads, who has these contracts, what is happening, because we need to understand all these key state actors as they are, when we're looking into what's going to happen to the election, who is interested and why are they interested in the economy of Zimbabwe? Are they interested in the good of the whole nation, or do they have their own self-interest, as it were? We have seen an undermining of our mining sector, with more than 60% of our gold output coming from the artisanal miners, who will be key constituents in the next election. So they have had more than 60% of our mining is from artisanal miners. We have concessionary mining rights all over the place. We have a huge share of our mining also being given to China, and a lot of lack of transparency in terms of our royalties and taxation on mining. And I say all these things to try and build a picture of who are the key state actors coming into 2023 election. I can also say that we can all agree at this point that there is no political will, especially by the ruling party elite. And I like to put these in a sub sector. We have the government of Zimbabwe as a whole, yes, But within that, we have the ruling party elite, which takes me back to 2018, when we saw the militarized coup. And that brought in a very, in fact, I can say not brought in, but it brought out a very important state actor in the military generals. And when you start to look at mining concessions, who owns what, who is invested where, you see a lot of these senior generals being part of the key stakeholders in terms of ownership and business, especially in the mining sector, and a few partnerships as well with Chinese entities, etc. So again, I highlight this before I go into the picture of how will this play out politically. Are these state actors worried about the ailing Zimbabwean dollar necessarily? Is it in their interest to even do something about that? And I don't think it is. I don't think we are here because we have people that want to actually do something about it. I think they stand to benefit a heck of a lot with this continued chaos. Therefore, the will to actually do the right thing, like Tinashe is suggesting in terms of, could we bring a currency board? Are they interested in getting things better before the elections? I personally don't think so. I think it is with what they're interested in is not losing power. And that's different between gaining the support and, endorsement of the electorate. I think their interest is in power and not in pleasing the electorate. So as well, what has happened in the last few years is our risk profile has worsened. We have no respect for property rights. And a lot of the business community, I believe, would echo this, especially this year. We had the central bank, for instance, banning lending. Like, how do you do that? How do you say no banks can lend to anyone anymore in the middle of a financial cycle? So our risk profile insofar as business is worsened. Ibo, you highlighted the latest statement, which was, we will freeze your accounts if we think you're dealing in the parallel market. Again, we see this infringement on property rights. Every now and again, we are reminded that the current regime has got no appetite to respect property rights, and how this is perceived by the business community at large is that it does worsen our risk profile. It will only attract a certain type of investor who is not necessarily interested in how well the infrastructure is functioning, in how many more young people in Zimbabwe will get employed. What they're simply interested in is maximizing and expropriating where they can and where they are. And as long as they can still continue to do that, they really have got no appetite to change. I want to thank Professor Hanke for the variation of the currency board, because as you know, Ibo, I have been very much against the idea of a currency board, but the idea that we could have a currency board that is situated elsewhere, even outside of Africa, I think that should be explored. I doubt very much that the current regime, this is something that they would be interested in. Like Tinashe alluded to, there's this definition of patriotism that the existing, that the regime tried to force upon us, with some of their mantras where they say, meaning that it is the people that should own every resource, which is not really what we're seeing, especially with China having more than, I think, a 50% stake in the mining sector, etc. So, we need to move away from some of these definitions. Poverty is not patriotic, productivity is patriotic. So if we can do something that can bring back our productive gains, then that will be a patriotic move. I mean, there's a very good reason why the central bank in South Africa, as was mentioned by Tinashe, is actually privately owned, is actually in part owned by countries like Switzerland and Turkey and Greece and Italy, etc. So we need to move really away from some of these mindsets that we're being railroaded through, and strip all that back. So what is happening and how will this pan out as we are moving into 2023? As we've all said, we are in a dire situation. The benefits that we have is we have the benefit of history. We have been here before 2007, 2008. where we did get to a point where we had no, in terms of hyperinflation. And actually, whilst we're talking about hyperinflation, sometimes I think we get so caught up in inflation, and really, how much does the inflation figure really tell us? I mean, for Zimbabwe, we are either extremely high inflation or less extremely high inflation. I think this is where we are. Some of the other more important.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Carry on.
Okay, sure. So how the current regime are actually, ZANU-PF are actually structuring the next election is where it gets interesting. So at the moment, we have a lack of economic transparency. We have seen, even in terms of how our reserves are reported, we're not even sure how much of the SDRs the Minister of Finance has used and what he has used them for. If you look on the IMF charts, Zimbabwe has used well above 50% of our SDRs. And yet, when you speak to the Minister of Finance, I think it's only recently that he said, oh, we finally used it. So if we haven't used it, we should be seeing our foreign reserve balance going up, but it's not going up. So we have all these smoke and mirrors when it comes to our budget statements, it comes to our debt statement. We don't really know how much money is there and what is it being used for. We can only speculate that with the upcoming elections, much of what should be in the national purse will divert towards keeping those who seek power in power. The fact that we still have a lack of transparency in mining. I mean, when the Minister of Finance came in as a minister, one of his key manifestos was how it's all going to be transparent. And and I think he at one point had the support of the IMF to try and understand the data in our mining sector, until they said, look, we can't do anymore. We don't know how much is being produced in the mining sector, and there's no traceability necessarily. We hear now of the gold coins, which is a bit bizarre, but here we are. We've got lack of transparency of who owns what, how much are we actually getting out of our mining sector. We have had reports that have been submitted by the Auditor General to ZAC around the corruption that's happening, not corruption, sorry, but around how the presentation of mining data is wholly inaccurate by some key mining players, but again, nothing has been done about that. We know that the current government has made some key alliances in the East, and who are benefiting a lot from this chaos. If you look at what's happening in Chiadzwa, who has concessionary mining rights, I think where there some of the private Sino-Zimbabwe companies are looking to mine almost 12 million carats within, I think, the next couple of years. And yet we don't even know in terms of royalties and taxation what has happened there. We're seeing new Chinese deals, by the month. We have done lithium most recently. We have moved. We know what's happening in the chrome sector with Zimasco being wholly owned by China. And so you start to wonder, this vested interest that China has in Zimbabwe, would they support a change in regime? And we're not sure. I mean, time will tell. But again, we can see from past activities, even in other African countries, of how this panned out. We look at countries of interest like Angola, Congo, and how Chinese presence almost promoted military presence, and kind of the chaos and the impact, the very negative impact that had on the general population. So as I'm painting this picture, we then think, okay, so what's going to happen after we get to October and there's a complete economic meltdown? Of course, it will be worse for the already impacted. In the face of poverty in Zimbabwe is female and it's young, and so we are going to see that worsen. We're going to see the health sector even more on its knees than it is now. I mean, it's going to be a disaster. And I'm not sure that the people of Zimbabwe can necessarily hang on until a mid-year election next year. However, if we go back to 2007, 2008, the response of the regime, unlike what Tinashe is saying, which is let's get more things back on the shelves, let's do better, the regime will respond in two ways, and that will be violence. And when it comes to election, that will be rigging, because that is what has happened in the past. That is what happened in 2007, 2008. The popularity of the ruling party was at its lowest. Why? Because people were at their hungriest. And this was widely reported. Mugabe knew it, everybody, we all were aware that everybody wanted a regime change. And so what we saw instead was, unfortunately, really sort of a high rate of election violence, which has been recorded, and to date, really nothing much has been done in the way of compensating some of the victims, etc. So with this, this has an impact in terms of how do we then look forward in terms of the elections. And this is where I think there becomes this kind of clarion call to others that are interested in the democracy of Zimbabwe for the greater good, to actually start now to prepare to counter the violence, to counter the election rigging, because we know that this is how they will respond. The response is not going to be, let's get a better economy, let's build more roads. The response will be, let's fund what we know works, and that is election violence and election rigging. Unfortunately, we have seen even more recently, I mean, just to give evidence to some of what I'm saying, we've just had a grant apparently from China to build the new parliament at a time where we hardly have any functioning hospitals, so it just goes to show you where the political will lies. And once you can understand that, you can almost then anticipate what will happen next. It will not be to get things to improve before the election. Instead, it will be to get to do more, to continue to shrink the democratic spaces ahead of the elections, because quite honestly, with what is happening now, unless you are in that subsector of the very elite, politically, shall I say, in the very political elite group, you are not really benefiting from anything. And even you, regardless of who your preferred political party to support is, you will not be supporting this to continue beyond 2023. I think I'll pause there for now, Ebo.
Before you pause, I want to come back to you. You said that the regime, the powers that be, are less concerned about responding to the obvious requirements and expectations of electorate than they are bent on capitalizing from the crisis. And then you went on to say that they can, in fact, stand up to that, the regime, through violence and rigging. Do you think that the content of the state right now, the nature and content of the state now, is of the same metal as it was in 2008 or even 2018? We hear of dissension and divisions within. You have seen recently evidence of that. What I'm saying basically, don't you think the regime knows that it's important to try and address these issues of the election? That's the first. The second is, we have seen what's going on in Sri Lanka, and partly this discussion, this conversation has been evoked what's happening in Sri Lanka, and therefore the implied extrapolation that this might happen in Zimbabwe, what's happening in Sri Lanka. And you made reference, of course, the Chinese debt in Sri Lanka, one of the highest. We just had today our debt to China's 13 billion plus. And clear indications that China has no capacity to cushion such crisis as we're seeing in Sri Lanka. Last week, Thursday, there were riots in Maputo. There have been rumblings in the region. And by contrast, I wanted to make the point to you, the contrast, I've just been in Zambia, East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda. And of course, they're 40 years ahead of us, Zimbabwe. I didn't see a US dollar at any time at all. The currency is stable, right? And gives an indication, and we have to come on this platform a number of times, bringing in the former governor of the Reserve Bank of Zambia, try and explain to us how do they do it in Zambia, after Kaunda, and get the Tanzanians to tell us how do they do it, and the Ugandans. And I think it's possible. What do you think of the currency board? I mean, is it possible? And to what extent do remittances, which are now almost 2 billion a year in the formal sense, a cushion against the kind of social unrest that we are seeing in Sri Lanka, even though the remittances have been a very important factor in Sri Lanka? Would you like to reflect on these observations quickly before we move to questions?
So with the first question around, are we seeing some sort of faction or, what's happening with the ruling party? Is it in the exact same state as it was 2007, 2008, perhaps? Like I said at the start, we have what I'm calling a subsector of the ruling party. That is the political party elite. It's not everybody. Everybody else is benefiting from crumbs from the table. We have key players that are literally minting it. They're making millions from deals in mining, from deals in contracts. And this is not everybody. And so, yes, we will see, what helped Mugabe a little bit in 2007, 2008, where the Jambanja from the war vets, he kind of brought in that constituency to support him. Whereas this existing regime does not have that luxury. You see, we have seen their relationship with the war vets. We have seen them putting the war veterans, in prison, which was just ridiculous. So we know that at the moment, for the majority, regardless of whether you are a ZANU-PF supporter or a CCC supporter, we are all suffering nearly exactly the same. And so, and I think obviously the political elite, like I say, they're very much aware. But when you then identify who they are and what resources they control, this is when the military arm comes into play. This is where the Chinese arm comes into play as well. And I think this is perhaps where they're hoping that kind of support or influence will enable them to retain power. And so it will be interesting how the rest of us counter that. And I think then you asked about what is happening in terms of China and what we are seeing in Sri Lanka and in Mozambique. And I think the Chinese, I've referred to it before on this platform as a domestic debt trap policy. Yes, you will get some debt, but I believe that how much and what you pay back, and the general populace are becoming very aware of that, is way more probably than what you've borrowed. And therein, and I think the Chinese have the advantage of being on both sides of the coin to some extent. Yes, we have some genuine Chinese private investors. We have some Chinese investors who do have a vested interest in seeing a better Zimbabwe, but I don't believe that overall these are the majority. So in terms of, will they bail Zimbabwe out perhaps through more debt? We already have had so much debt from China, and yet here we are, When we then look at the idea of remittances, and myself is, I can speak personally to this as somebody within that diaspora constituency. Unfortunately, the remittances that are running into billions every month that are coming from the diaspora are not really productive remittances. This is money that is simply passing through Zimbabwe and back into the diaspora in some means, whether it's back to South Africa or back to Zambia, etc. It's money that we're using for hospital bills, for maybe even funeral expenses. And when you try and track okay, so when we pay for hospital bills, what does that look like? It's back to Tinashe's point of people putting their money under the mattresses and going to spend that money outside of Zimbabwe. So we do not have that multiplier effect from diaspora remittances that some other countries have benefited. You know, like you look at India, possibly Sri Lanka as well, I think, and the Philippines, that have really benefited from the diaspora remittances because of that multiplier effect of money coming in. Money comes in from the Zimbabwean diaspora, but unfortunately, it is leaking out. It is not productively consumed. And so we are not really benefiting from those remittances, unfortunately. And I believe, as we are seeing even here in the UK, the inflation rates are coming up. Therefore, as the inflation rates are increasing, we will not actually benefit as much. There will not be as much diaspora remittances as well. So I can't remember, sorry, what your last question was.
Back to you, but the point I was trying to make was, to what extent do remittances and secondly, informalization of the economy, and thirdly, the extent to which the diaspora has depleted Zimbabwe of activists like yourself. 75% of Zimbabwean skills and professionals outside the country, and that would have depleted also social, civic society, and its capacity to react in organized fashion. And I was mentioning this in passing, but I wanted to get back to your colleagues, to Stephen and Tinashe, and ask specifically, what are the possibilities apropos this discussion and of having this currency board set up? Can I start with Stephen?
Sorry, Ibo, you did ask about the currency board. I can come back with my response to that if you like, or I can give it now. I forgot about that.
You can carry on. Go
yeah.
Get to it.
So in terms of the currency board, like I said, for the first time hearing the alternative of having something set up in Switzerland, because my view even was in terms of having an anti-corruption committee is something I've been thinking about a lot, and thinking that this needs to be outside Zimbabwe. It needs to be run by non-Zimbabwe residents. So the idea of having such a currency board outside of Zimbabwe is plausible. However, we have the issue of today, we don't have enough transparency even to understand foreign reserves. You know, so how would we anchor? What would be the anchor? Because we don't really know. I think in the last budget statement, we had 280 million was reported as being of foreign reserves. And obviously that would be inadequate, I think, to use as an anchor for a currency board. I would be more minded to go towards the idea of dollarization, as I've said before. I think, yes, we would not get the full benefits from dollarization because we are where we are with whom we are with. And so, you know, there would always be some opportunities for this to be exploited. However, that would reduce significantly because at the moment, we are seeing this Zimbabwe dollar. I mean, it's there for arbitrage purposes in the most cases, to be honest. We are not benefiting if by October, we still have the multi-currency, the civil servants that receive their salaries in Zim dollars will just not be able to afford to even a basic, you know, meal a day, you know. So I personally would say that I would prefer dollarization over the currency board. I also don't think that our legal framework in the way that it is being handled at the moment by the policymakers would actually stand up to the test of a currency board, because we are subjected day in, day out to sporadic statutory instruments, some that are even non-constitutional. So even if you were to set up a currency board and assign a legal framework towards it, I am not sure that the current government would necessarily adhere to that. And so that to me puts that at risk. I think it's a good idea, perhaps for the future, but not presently.
Let's go back to Stephen, Hanke, and Tinashe, and then after I would welcome comments from our very august gathering here tonight. Stephen, first of all, comments on Tinashe and Chennai, and again, a focus on possibilities.
Okay, so let me begin quickly. By the way, after I make my brief comments, I'm going to have to depart because I'm being called to comment on what's going on in Italy. As you know, the president of Italy has just accepted the resignation of Draghi and as a prime minister. So I'm going to have to attend to that in a few minutes. One thing that is important today, actually, is the first day that the inflation rate has gone up to over 50% per month. Today, it's 56.6% per month is the inflation rate in Zimbabwe. It's just shot up. And if that continues for 30 more days, then you will go in the Hanke Cruise World Hyperinflation table, which is really now become in effect the official record-keeping spot for hyperinflation. So if it keeps up for 29 more days at this level, you will be the 65th hyperinflation episode in world history. The only thing I would say about Tinashe's comments, he's confused a lot of things, making distinctions between currency boards and dollarization. There is no difference. Technically, there absolutely is no difference. All he's talking about problems with clearing and so forth. Those problems would occur under either a currency board or a dollarized system. I should say they should be eliminated under both of those systems, but there is no difference between a currency board system and a dollarized system in any meaningful way. The only difference is that with a currency board, you do have a local unit of account, a local currency, whereas with dollarization, you do not, but everything else is the same. As far as Chennai's comments are concerned, although I agree with many of the things that she had to say, particularly about how the elites are ripping off the mining sector and that there's no transparency and so forth. But remember, the only way all this laundry list of problems that she enunciated will ever be solved is to solve the monetary authority and central bank problem. You have to mothball a central bank and put it into a museum. That's the end of the story. And whether you substitute it with a currency board located outside the country again, or dollarization, it really doesn't make any difference. You just have to get rid of the central bank. That is the nub of the problem. And if you don't get rid of it, you won't have stability. And without stability, you won't be able to solve any of the transparency problems or property rights problems or anything else. And all you have to do, by the way, to look at a successful development strategy, the most successful one of the most successful ones in history has been Singapore. It became independent in 1965, and they had a leader who stepped up, Lee Kuan Yew. Now that's a very interesting thing, a leader with a vision. And what was the first thing he did? He kept the currency board, the Malaysian currency board. So they had a currency board, they had a hard budget constraint, they had sound money. The second thing, which of course you would have to re-educate everybody in Zimbabwe about this, they didn't pass the begging bull. He refused to take any foreign aid whatsoever in Singapore. And the reason for that, he thought that the foreign aid would simply end up increasing corruption, reduce the discipline in the system, and create perverse incentives. The third thing was he wanted a small, lean, and mean public sector. And the fourth thing, he wanted first world competitiveness in Singapore, and you got that with open free trade without any interference. The fifth thing, protection of private property, protection of private property. The sixth thing, public safety. And what you had is a situation where Singapore was one of the poorest places on the planet in 1965. There were tremendous ethnic tensions, almost a civil war was ready to break out. And in a little more than 50 years, you have the second richest country in the world on a per capita basis, Singapore. So we know what has to be done. And the starting point for these developments always is the same: sound money, sound money. And the only way to get it in Zimbabwe, you've got to get rid of the central bank. That's the problem. So with that, I'm Ibo. I'm unfortunately I'm going to have to depart. I've been on now for an hour and a half, but I must leave. Thank you for inviting me.
No, thank you for putting yourself so admirably and predictably. Thank you very much indeed, and I'm sure my colleagues will join me in thanking you to find the time to join us. We take note. This conversation is recorded. It will be transcribed and published. So thanks, Stephen, and goodbye. Now, Tinashe, you heard what Stephen had to say about your comments on the currency board, but you did make a reference to the possibility, or rather that there are people in the system who favor such a thing. Do you think it's that we can have a currency board, whether it's locally or it's in Africa or in Switzerland? Is it possible?
It's most certainly possible, but not in Zimbabwe. As we've continuously highlighted, that it will have to be anchored in South Africa or the Africa Development Bank for numerous reasons that we've highlighted. I think that there are lots of people who are interested in the idea and who see it as a possibility. The alternative is cash dollarizing. I think that people will not put their money in the banking system. They will continuously hold cash. And if they're holding US dollar cash, then the economy actually contracts even further. The idea of having a currency board or having your reserves out of the matrices and in a South African or Africa Development Bank account is you can actually leverage off those reserves in the local market. So you tend to find that if you look at the private sector lending that has actually happened, or loans and advances in Zimbabwe, they have contracted to less than $1 billion US. At the height of 2012, 2013, these used to be $4 billion US. So what you want is you want a financial services system that is able to grow. And it can only grow if we anchor ourselves in a hard currency. So that's where I agree with Steve. I disagree. You know, if you look at the fuel companies, for example, this is where we have a point of departure. The fuel companies insist on cash. You know, if anywhere else in the world, you should be able to swipe for your fuel, right, in US dollars. And it should be US dollars. So I think that if our reserves are anchored outside of the country, then locally we can still use the Zimbabwean dollar. We can use a domestic currency. Those that want to keep the US dollar are still able to do so, right? You can still keep your US dollar. You can still do whatever you want with your US dollar. But in terms of our trade should be with our counterparties, and it should be a basket of goods or a basket of currencies. So we should be able to trade in rands with the yuan, US dollar. So those are the distinctions I make, just understanding the nuances of Zimbabwe, that there's a reason why people are keeping money in cash boxes. Nowhere else in the world do you find people choosing to keep cash in cash box in a bank, right? You walk in your bank and you choose to keep cash in a cash box and not in your account. So those are the distinctions I make. Do I think that the currency board is possible? Is it feasible? Are there people that are interested in it? You'll be so surprised, Ivo, that the more and more we talk about it, the more and more people want to understand it. A lot of the times what happens in Zimbabwe is just pure ignorance, that a lot of people are adverse or do not want the idea purely because they don't understand it. So the more and more we talk about it, the more and more, certainly a lot more people are interested in the idea. People always want solutions. Do we see it happening? I don't think so. I agree with Chennai, and Chennai is probably right that they will not implement. There are other competing ideas or other competing requirements or needs, more specifically political, that make it very difficult to immunize ourselves or to disband the RBZ. So it may not happen, but it should not stop us from putting it as our position as business, specifically as business and as society, that the more and more we talk about it, one day the political change will happen. We've seen what has happened in the UK, for example. You know, political change happens all the time. What you want are good ideas that are on the shelf that a good politician will be able to pick. So, and that's really all we can do. I'm not here to speculate on whether or not it can be implemented, but I can certainly tell you that there are people within government, there are people who are very influential, who are very much interested in the idea.
I'll come back to you at the end. We have 20 minutes to the end. I will come back to you, and would help us, please, Tinashe, just outline the elements of a currency board and how such a process would be undertaken. I'll come back to you. I will now take comments. Please raise your hands. There's Tony Rila.
Thank you, and thank you to Stephen, Tinashe, and Chennai. I'm much more educated about the problems. I'm a little confused, and I'd like some comment on this. The text of the process of the conversation is that there are a number of steps we need to take in the future. But Tinashe is pointing out, and I think so is Chennai, that in the interregnum between those steps being taken, the citizenry is going to be hit by hardship on a scale that I don't think we've been seeing before. October is going to be a breaking point, and already we can see that on the statistics of what's happening to the livelihoods of ordinary people, people are in a parlous situation. So I'm wondering whether we even get to an election. What's the point at which the trust of the citizenry breaks completely and utterly? You know, we're classified as one of the most fragile states in the world, and it seems to me that fragility sometimes mutates into fail, which is when people don't actually go to work. They stop going to work. They find other routes to do this thing. So the question I'm having to ask is a very simple one, is will we even get to an election? And if we are faced with the kind of resistance that the citizens are going to have to put up in the hardship they face, what other alternative will the state have but massive coercion we've seen before? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other hands? I raised the point earlier on. Whose hand is up?
It's Jana Ibo. Yes. Hi.
Welcome, my dear. How are you?
Thank you. I'm very well. Thank you to the speakers. And I put my question in there for Tinashe and Chennai. And I'll build on what Tony has really said. I think so well articulated on the kind of rulership that is experienced in Zimbabwe with the upcoming elections and this economic pressure cooker we are being put in. What are the options for ordinary Zimbabweans? I really do not expect any leadership from what we have at the moment, number one. Number two, what for those organizations that are engaged in proposing alternative solutions beyond, I think, the options around the monetary policy that, I mean, that we've talked into this evening. What are some of the things that people should be putting on the table, at least for posterity, to say at least these are some of the things that are being laid out as a potential roadmap for Zimbabwe that you would propose, that maybe civil society, opposition groups can at least vocalize on behalf of the population? Thanks, Ibo.
Thanks, Jana. I'd made a point earlier on about the capacity or the resilience of the Zimbabwean population as evidenced over the last 20 years. The appear to be three, which one might argue has been also prevented or has caused the state to capitalize on the apparent, what can I call it, not dumbness of the population, but one is the migration out of the country. People have a avenue. South Africa, millions are there, and that has taken off the pressure. The second is the informalization of the economy, to the point where, I mean, I don't know if people here know that the Musika in Bare, for the last 2 years, they have not used Zimbabwe dollars at all. You have to go there, you buy US dollars. The informal sector, the informal sector is competing with the formal sector in terms of supply of goods and services. And of course, the third, as I said earlier on, is the depletion of civic society. So I just wanted to raise those and get responses to it. So for those who have been looking at the Sri Lanka as a possible model of what might happen here. I see a number of people here, P.S. Pigu, I see Chanakira, Hussein, Maud Blair, Love Mogadenge, Hopeful Chingono, Freeman Kembo, Francis Lovemore. Come on, let's hear you. Chris Kofa, David Steele. Any responses before I go back to the panelists? Hello? Oprah? Lovemore?
Hello?
Yes, come on.
Yes, my worry, well, very interesting discussion.
Identify yourself, please. Identify yourself.
Is Lovemore Kadenge?
Yes, Lovemore.
Yes, yes. My worry is I listened to the discussion in terms of 2023. I had a practical example. I went yesterday to check my name, you know, at the local police station, local station where I vote, you know, because for this delimitation exercise. And I was very disappointed because I was the only one there. And I was told that the whole day, very few people are coming. One, to check whether their names are there, And now I think this is really a challenge for us, for civic society, and also for political parties. If people don't exercise their right to vote, you know, there is a lot of discontent. People do come to various rallies and so forth, but our people are not registering to vote. They are not checking their names. So what change will come if people don't participate? And I'm sure this is a challenge for political parties, but this is also a challenge for civic society organizations and also these platforms. I'm not seeing that, and I believe this is everywhere. There is apathy, except where we have these churches, you know, where we've seen, you know, politicians going to church meetings, you know, the Apostol in particular. And to me, I'm posing a question as well. There is a challenge that we need to mobilize our people, especially the young, to get registered, to get national registration certificate and participate. And that's the only way in which they can see the change they want. In the absence of that, we'll always be crying. Thank you.
Thanks, Lovely. Reverend Sibanda, Sibanda.
Yes, thank you so much. Good evening.
You and you. Nice to see you. Welcome.
Thank you. Just one of my questions is maybe, can this economic crisis translate itself into citizens behaving like what happened in Sri Lanka and in the Zimbabwean equation? Why can't it happen that way? But also, I think one of the key issues if you're working on at grassroots level, I'm realizing is there's such a nexus or you know, a mixture of the economy, desperation of people, youth trying to get something to do with politics. They are very vulnerable. In other words, they become easier to use as political tools, whether it is in violence, mobilization, or almost like militia groups. If we look at the situation with the mining, where there is the artisanal miners, the Mashurukis and so forth, who later on turned out to be more militia groups, really. So I don't know, how do we break that? Because the more the economy collapses, the more these people become tools, easier to use as tools, because people are more desperate. It's not like translating into a Sri Lanka situation, but rather it's the opposite, where it becomes easier to use these people. So I don't know whether maybe how you guys as political scientists, how do you read this? Why is the Zimbabwe situation unique? Why is it not translating into something else?
Thanks, Reverend. Nigel and Piers, I believe you have something to say. Nigel Chanakira?
Thanks, Ibo. I mean, I came quite late onto the platform.
But
somehow I'm no longer.
Comment on the topic.
Oh yes, I mean, of course, but there's a risk that I may be duplicating myself, so I'll be very brief.
Okay.
I think, you know, what is of concern to me, Ibo, is the fact that yes, it is it is true, you know, people have left, but there are those of us who are still present, and we're watching this movie, which, I mean, for lack of a better word, you can call the perfect storm building up. And I hear very few voices of reason, you know, coming to the fore. And obviously you're hosting these meetings quite regularly is most welcome. You know, the hopefuls of this world continuously, you know, do make statements. But, you know, my greatest disappointment is business. Business seem cozy in this environment. They've cozied up, in my view, to the to the circumstances and situation. Their heads are in the sand, so to speak, and they're making money. And I don't know whether that is a prudent move within itself, because we are really staring at what could be a perfect storm. When you engage, I wear the hat, as you might recall, of the president of the Economic Society. We are repeatedly told that the economic variables are sound, the macroeconomic picture is looking good, despite the precipitous decline of the strength of our currency. So that's all very, very worrying within itself. And I keep asking, where is the social fabric of our people? In the context of what is actually taking place. The center cannot possibly hold. This situation, of course, I mean, Tinashe's repeated clamoring for a currency board is totally inconceivable. I can't, I've attended fora in the past couple of months, since about March or April, just before the IMF meetings. The Minister of Finance got onto his plane and everything was honky-dory. But what happened subsequently, May, June, July, macroeconomic aggregates have been an absolute disaster. And when you actually try to make reason with regards to the fact that no economic fundamentals, no economic policy making can withstand the perfect storms or the waves that are coming with regards to social and political unrest. I think, again, we are talking to people who perhaps are incoherent somewhat, or are living in a bubble somehow, and they think we can make it to the next election. And that is very worrying. The final point, of course, is that we've got, as I say, I keep saying it's a perfect storm. You've got the Ukraine-Russia situation, which is militating against any moves, because you've got global inflation that is really descendant on all nations. And yet we as a country are operating under sanctions. So we're trying to fight this whole thing almost with one hand. You're not engaged with international capital. You don't have access to lines of credit. You don't have supplier credit. And yet you are supposed to withstand, the fuel, food, fertilizer, triple F sort of scenario. So it speaks and makes, it truly is. I don't know where that sound comes from.
Carry on, Nigel.
So, so where are we? Are we failing to totally communicate with the policymakers? I mean, even yesterday's announcement, if you look and hear that there's a new city that's being built, without any trickle down, this is an economy now for what? For the elites, clearly. People in the rural areas, people in the urban areas are really facing severe, price increases, nutrition, be it the education, the teachers are not going to school. So we've got a total disaster in the making. And yet we seem not to be communicating at all. We are living, Ibo, in two separate worlds: the ruling elite and the masses. And there is absolutely no connect that I can see. And so I'm saying, is it that paucity that you speak about in terms of the intellectuals having left? Or what is it? Why are we not communicating? Why can we not understand each other? because truthfully, we can't get to an election. It becomes a military state. And even a military state within itself is not an end in itself, because if you can't feed a nation, people say kusiri kufande kupi. So I'm wondering whether I'm living in a separate world. I'm wondering whether we are communicating or we fail to communicate altogether. Because that currency, certainly by October, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000. I don't know whether there are any further bids on where that exchange rate is going. It is just slipping so fast. And yet that is the currency that is still used to pay, not only civil servants, by the way, but also the employees. And yet, business within itself, if we don't wake up to the fact that we have to now pay our employees with US dollars for them to actually come to work, then they won't come to work, even within the private sector. And that little capacity utilization that is there will just not happen. So mine is more, I guess, a rhetorical question. Are we communicating, or are we whistling in the wind? What is going on? I rest my case. I'm disheartened. I'm, in a sense, disappointed. And what is building up to a perfect storm is just the waves are actually, the tide is coming in, and a lot of people will be found with their pants down. I thank you.
Thanks, Nigel. Nigel Chandakira, President of Zimbabwe Economic Society, the businessman. Thanks very much. I got Temba and Temba Ndebele, right? And after Temba, I will call on P.S. Pigo and ask him to reflect. Yes, Temba.
Yes. Ibo, I just want to comment on what Nigel has said, right? That when you look at business in this country, what has business been reduced to? It's been reduced to food, it's been reduced to fuel, and it's been reduced to agricultural inputs, right? All business that is relating to the quality of life or the creation of a middle class in this country is gone. Okay? You have a stock exchange where your most highly capitalized company is alcohol, is liquor. And that just shows you there is something wrong. And then secondly, Nigel, when you have, as Ipo says, 75% of your skilled people and middle class residing outside the country, then it is difficult for people to actually realize how bad things are. You have a situation where people are struggling, but most of these people don't know any better. Then it becomes difficult. And there are several stories in Africa that you can, that relate to that. Okay? That's my contribution, Ipo.
Thanks, Temba. Thanks. Piers?
Thanks, Eva. And thanks for the discussion. I'm sorry I missed the first end of it. I just wanted to make one comment about the regional dynamic here, because I think it's important to look at opportunities to keep folk in South Africa engaged on this issue. I was in a conversation earlier today where we were looking at the different policy positions that were being taken by the South African Communist Party in the latest Congress, which are quite a good set of findings in relation to the situation in Zimbabwe, juxtaposed against the ANC's discussion document, which has a very disappointing focus on migration and the criminalization of migration, really, around the situation in Zimbabwe. So, I mean, my contribution here is to urge the extension of this conversation into the regional dynamic as well, because I think that the region has a blind eye to the situation in Zimbabwe, and although there is an opportunity now for influencing those discussions. Thanks, Eva.
Thanks, Piers. I wanted to ask you, what have you heard about Mozambique, Piers? The riots last week, there was hardly any mention of them here. So
yeah, and there was very little
saying,
mention. Very little. Are you talking about these were the protests
right.
From the taxi drivers?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, there was very little mention of it here as well. I think it's passed over really in many ways.
No, thanks. I think at this rate I'll go back to Chennai to say the last few words, and then Tinashe to conclude on the, as I implored him earlier on the currency board and how it can be formed, established, and how it operates, and how, more important, how we can escalate it into the ranks of the policymakers and get more traction around it. Chennai?
This has been a really great discussion, Ibo. It's been really interesting listening to some of the other attendees and what they've been saying. And I think as a point of reflection for myself is obviously how many more of these conversations do we have amongst each other where we actually know, you know? So I think there is something to be said about taking the conversation out there to different groups that do not necessarily have the same knowledge that we all do on this platform right now. So that is a good point of reflection. I feel that where we are now, there is an opportunity for citizens as a whole to just really intentionally come together to get out of this frying pan. I know somebody said earlier that it feels like we're in a pressure cooker. And I would say we're actually in a frying pan. I think a pressure cooker is a bit more gentle. We're in a frying pan. Some like me have escaped and jumped out, but I think we need to come together to really save the majority, because as much as we are talking about it, there is a lived reality by Zimbabweans. We would all know somebody right now who's either really unwell or or has actually passed on for reasons that they could have been saved, but because we do not have an adequate health system. And we will start to see a lot more of these in the days and months to come. So we really need to intentionally come together. We need the civic society to partner with us on this, because we do not want to be, Zimbabwe is very resource rich. We have a lot of things that should be going well for us. And I think if civic society's aim is for the betterment of the lives of people in Zimbabwe, then the idea of an overhaul, of a complete change, should appeal to them just as much. And I think we need their support to take the message out there and to really try and move towards this kind of congregation of citizenry towards change. So I would say that's a point to put across over and over again until it happens. In terms of the future, in terms of currency boards, etc., I think these are all really great, sound economic policies. I would only encourage people like Tinashe to think about, let's look at a transformed Zimbabwe. Let's not try and think of ideas that only facilitate what we have today. Let's reimagine Zimbabwe and think, okay, if we reimagine Zimbabwe, do we really want to be exposed to the risks in South Africa? Do we really want to take on ADB, who might have some sort of moral dilemma? Because as much as they are the development bank, we do owe them some money and we have some other engagements with them. So I think we need to start really to reimagine Zimbabwe and to think about, what could we do in a perfect scenario, rather than how do we make things work and protect or, still have what we have today. And I think if we start to think more like that, we get better and more, transformation, rather than just trying to fix or fudge what we have today. Because in no time at all, we will be back where we are now. So yeah, I think I will leave it at that for now, Ibo. Again, thanks for having me. It's been a great discussion to be a part of.
No, thank you, Soon, just now. In the meantime, we'll move to Tinashe.
Thank you very much, Ibo. There was a time when the idea of a new constitution was inconceivable in Zimbabwe. And there was a time when there was a push for a new constitution. They were called MAD, those that were in that period. This was obviously before our time, but there were those in 99 or even before who pushed for a new constitution. And, you know, they were told that they were mad. And lo and behold, we now have a new constitution with new institutions. So the idea of a currency board, and whether it's conceivable or not, it's actually as real as the new constitution was. And it's a question of us just drumming up as much support as we can. But I want to draw you to the actual constitution. Chapter 17, section 317, where he talks about the Reserve Bank. The actual constitution says, that's the second point, an act of parliament may provide for the structure and organization of the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe and confer or impose additional functions to it. The constitution as it currently stands gave an allowance for us to reconstitute, to reform, to come up with a way in which we would want our monetary system to be held, or we would additional functions, we could add additional functions to it. So it's actually given us a lot of room. The Constitution has given us a lot of room to formulate and to implement a new monetary system. And we're saying we're at a very good point. This is a perfect storm in the sense that we're all very much aware that something has to be reformed at the central bank. And we're all very much aware of all our other problems. But all our other problems are exacerbated by a magnitude because of our monetary system. Now, the Constitution has given us the right to reformulate, to come up with a new, to reimagine, to use Janai's words. Why don't we take it? Now, the fact that the current politicians may not implement it didn't stop our predecessors, and certainly shouldn't stop us today. If this is the Zimbabwe that we want, that has a stable monetary system, a rules-based monetary system, then I suggest that this is the perfect time for us to do so. Now, I know that a lot of people want to boil the ocean, and they very well can do so because we've got a debt problem, we've got a political problem, we've got many problems. But I think that for business and society at this point in time, there's one thing that we can all agree on, whether you're ZANU-PF or CCC or anyone, you can agree that the current version of the central bank has failed. We can all agree on that. And what we need to do is take on the mandate that we've been given by the Constitution to reconstitute the central bank and to reimagine it and to put it in a way that it can help our monetary system and we can save our monetary system. I am advocating for a currency board, and we can have that discourse. That is what happened with the Constitution was being reimagined in 99, 2000. There was a lot of public discourse in the Sunday Mail everywhere so that people were aware of what a new constitution could mean. Perhaps we can have that sort of conversation again because we are all agreed the central bank has failed. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Tinashe. Thanks. Well, before I thank you, Chennai and Stephen, I just want to say, well, we're very at an interesting discussion. We tried to look at the extent of the economic and financial crisis. Stephen gave us some frightening figures, 600% inflation, 50% month by month, and the scaring figure from Tinashe that we probably have 2,000 to $1 US by December. and that this crisis looming come October already, in the form of crisis around food shortage, crisis around the next agricultural season. We have not sufficiently examined the causes of why history is repeating itself, whether this is by design, has to do with providing an avenue for arbitrage and corruption, or it's simply incompetence. And I think Tinashe has done well to show us the serious economic implications. Fenai had a more difficult task to try and draw scenarios about the possible political ramifications. I think she did well to warn us, even though I threw in the three factors, namely the remittances, increasing informalization of the economy, and of course the depletion of civic society. But I'd like to end on this note from one of our participants. I want to name him, and because I've not been able to get his permission, but he said this: in my view, the regime is currently far more fragile at this time compared to Mugabe's period. They have no answer to the current meltdown. There's virtually no food now, and they're unable to control anything. Everyone, including the security forces, are feeling the pinch. Interesting times. End of quote. This is from a senior economist in our country, a former civil servant. We were together in the government in 1980 as the first group of senior African civil servants, and a very ardent observer of the economic situation in Zimbabwe. I didn't want to end on that very depressing note, but those in Harare will be experiencing, apart from the economic situation that we're going through in Zimbabwe, you also have a very unusual situation on the 21st of July, heavy rain out there in Harare. On that note, I want to thank you all, and in particular, Stephen, Tinashe, and Chinai. And for Tinashe and Chinai, I'm sorry to burden you over and over again, but you really are an asset. And we hope that these discussions, we'll be back to these discussions, of course. We can increase the coverage, have more people participate. But this one, as all the other policy dialogues, are recorded, will be transcribed. They'll be on YouTube in the next two or 3 hours. And you'll be getting them back to you in printed form. Also visit our website, Surplus Trust, where you can visit and revisit some of these discussions. Thank you very much, and goodbye.